Howdy, and welcome to another episode of Untold Tales from this side of nowhere. As you know, I'm your host, Connor Jones, and I'm here bringing you another story from just about as close as you can get to the middle of nowhere. That is, Poverty Flats, Wyoming. You might notice that my voice is a little off this week because I am recovering from a cold or the flu or something. But I think I've got enough voice to stumble through this episode, so bear with me. Before we get rolling, let me tell you about our sponsors. This week's episode is sponsored by Basins Market, located in Basin, Wyoming. Basins Market is your destination for groceries, fresh produce, and the best meat department in the Bighorn Basin. Come in and sample their wide selection of products Monday through Saturday from 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. and Sundays from noon to 6 p.m. We're also sponsored by the Wyoming Welcome Program. You've probably seen the Table Talk brochures they place on restaurant tables in Cody and Powell. And if you happen to be a business owner who would like to get your name out there, these brochures are perfect for you. They feature the month's holidays, jokes, fun facts about Wyoming, and ads from local businesses. So if you would like to be included, please contact Haley J, that's HALEYJ, at WyomingWelcome.com. She'll be happy to get you included in one of the brochures. And now, the podcast. Like I said, I've been fighting a cold. I came down with it probably last Tuesday. Yeah, and Wednesday I stayed home from work. Thursday and Friday I still went in and taught my classes. It was the end of a quarter right before spring break, and the 3A and 4A basketball tournaments were going on down in Casper. So Thursday and Friday, my Spanish classes watched the Powell Panthers play basketball in Casper because I was miserable and I didn't have a voice at all. And they had finished all their tests and things, so I tell you, I probably broke some kids' hearts, but they managed to tough it through a period of Spanish watching basketball. But yeah, I'm feeling better. It's been over a week. This has been one of the longest lasting illnesses I've ever had. But I plan on being better soon. I've been trying to get more sleep, and this week is spring break. So I've been home with the kids, and it's been a wild ride with three. We've got 3 kids now with the birth of William on February 16th. So just want to remind you, if you haven't checked it out on our Facebook page, we picked a winner for the Untold Tales from this side of nowhere Fishing Failure Hall of Shame. And we're talking about and we did draw some winners. Also, if you didn't get a chance to go over to the Untold Tales from this side of nowhere Facebook page, we drew some winners for our Untold Tales from this side of nowhere Fishing Failure Hall of Shame. And a big shout out, congratulations to McKay Hancock and Sons. They will be receiving their very own Untold Tales from this side of nowhere Possibles kit. So congratulations. Next year, go ahead and participate in the Hall of Shame competition for your chance to win as well. Now, let's go ahead and jump into the story here. The title of this week's story is What Would You Do for a Klondike? And if you've never heard of a Klondike campout before, and you're wondering why I didn't say Klondike bar, this is a certain type of winter campout that the Boy Scouts usually do every year, and they don't eat ice cream bars, but they do get pretty cold. And that is what this story is about. So, hold on, here we go. Camping comes with a host of challenges. First, camping means sleeping on the ground. Next, it means sleeping outside. It also means eating outside, grooming yourself outside, going to the bathroom outside, and, in short, doing everything you usually do, but outside. Any boy will tell you that camping is both the best part and the worst part of his existence, a little like gasoline is to a pyromaniac. Camping is fantastic on the front end. You get to look forward to being outside, getting away from it all, and staring into a fire for hours at a time. During the campout, you get to enjoy an endless supply of mosquito bites, food that with a little luck has only been seasoned with a healthy amount of ash and smoke, and nothing worse, and the satisfaction of knowing you have chosen the least comfortable bit of dirt within a 100-mile radius on which to pitch a tent. After the campout, your outing continues to offer you perks because you have a new supply of stories to tell. You can brag to all your friends about how much more rugged you are than they are, and you always appreciate your bed that much more after going without it for a day or two. The benefits are practically endless. All this being said, it is possible for camping to lose some of its luster. By the end of a long summer, some people report feeling burnt out or suffering from camping fatigue. This occurs when someone has gone camping several weekends in a row and the suffering of sleeping outside is starting to lose its edge. This condition is most often reported in mid to late August and is a major problem in many warmer parts of the country. Dare I say it, camping can become somewhat monotonous if someone does too much of it, just like eating pizza from that one restaurant every weekend. Well, if you find yourself wondering why getting eaten alive by mosquitoes or enduring a night with a rock digging into your kidneys no longer offers the thrill it used to, then boy have I got the thing for you. It's called winter camping. Now, before you question my sanity, allow me to inform you that winter camping removes many of the challenges posed by warm weather camping. First, insects are not an issue when it comes to winter camping. Imagine a camping trip with absolutely no mosquitoes. Sounds intriguing, doesn't it? You have to ask yourself, where would most of the suffering come from if you got rid of the mosquitoes? While you may think the cold alone offers enough of a change of pace to make winter camping the antidote to camping fatigue, I must remind you that you can always get cold camping during the summer if you plan things right. I'm not saying you should count out the cold and its misery-causing potential, but I am saying there is a lot more to winter camping than you may know. I admit I have engaged in winter camping only once, but I feel the experience went well enough. I may consider myself to have received a master course in this particular realm of the outdoors. It all began innocently enough. It was January, and the local Council of Boy Scouts had planned their annual Klondike campout. None of us in Troop 41 had been aware there was an annual Klondike campout, but apparently that was because Marty's dad, Mr. Flincherton, had gone to great lengths to keep that information from us. After Eli Lyman became our scoutmaster, that all changed, however. Eli informed us one Wednesday night shortly after we returned to weekly meetings following Christmas break that there was going to be a winter campout, and boy, were we excited. A winter campout? My cousin Jim asked in disbelief. Like, right now, with the snow and everything? Do they know how cold it gets at night during January in Wyoming? Now I know what you're thinking, Eli said, a placating hand raised. I know winter camping sounds kind of crazy, but it's actually not that bad if you do it right. Fred and I exchanged a glance. This was similar to the word track Eli had used when he convinced us that the grass and twig shelter he had us build for the Outdoor Survival Merit Badge would be safe as houses, before a rabid squirrel attacked us inside it. I don't know, Eli, I began. Don't you think we'll freeze to death? My sleeping bag was rated for -15 degrees, but I had come close to hypothermia at a mere 34. Of course not, Eli said with a dismissive wave of his hand. I'll take my wall tent with the stove. We'll be so warm you'll think you've had gone to a hotel instead of Deaver Reservoir. And best of all, there won't be any mosquitoes. Before we knew what had happened, Eli had us nodding in agreement. There would be a wood stove inside the tent. Winter camping was starting to sound a whole lot better. Eli rubbed his hands together with glee and said, Okay, boys, here's the packing list for this campout. The council put her together, but I took some liberties and added a few of my own suggestions. Remember to bring lots of warm clothes now. I was looking forward to the campout all week, and Fred and I drug out all the camping equipment that had been languishing in the basement since nighttime lows had dipped below 40 degrees. We had our sleeping bags, some dehydrated food, and lots of warm clothing. Dad had even let us raid his stash of Hot Hands hand warmers, and we were starting to believe winter camping might not be an insane proposition after all. We would be nice and toasty in the wall tent with its accompanying stove. We didn't have to hike anywhere, so we could bring a huge roll of soft bedding, and there would be no mosquitoes. Heck, winter camping was almost too good to be true. Just when I thought I would actually be having a camping trip that was free of suffering, I came down with a cold. And not just any old cold. Oh no, I came down with a special misery of an upper respiratory infection. The night before the Klondike, I started sneezing, coughing and wheezing, and my nose started running like a freight train down both sides of the tracks, if you know what I mean. Mom supplied me with my own 500-count box of tissues, but they were no match for the cold. I don't know if you should go on the campout tomorrow, Mom said, eyeing the wastebasket filled to the brim with used tissues. Oh, Mom, I said in a nasally voice brought on by my stuffy nose. I'm all right. This'll just help me build some character. I wasn't typically big on activities that contributed to my character development, especially since my parents always seemed to think working was the chief source of character building. But since I knew my mother was a big fan of anything that would help me in the character department, I figured it would be the perfect way to convince her to let me go on the winter campout, even though I was sick. Well, I guess you'll be all right. Just take a box of tissues with you. I beamed and flopped down in bed. I didn't stir for the rest of the night, except to blow my nose, which I did about every 15 minutes. The day of the campout dawned clear and cold like most January days in northwestern Wyoming. Fred rubbed the sleep from his eyes and groaned as we went to join the family in the dining room for breakfast. How'd you boys sleep? Mom asked as she set the table. Oh, all right, I grunted through my stuffed-up nose. Terrible, Fred groaned. Al was up every 15 minutes blowing his nose. He sounds like an elephant. Hey, I huffed. I do not sound like an elephant. Boys, Mom shouted, calm down and eat some breakfast. I'm supposed to have you to the American Legion by 10, and you need to load all your stuff. I also have some chores for you to finish up before you go. Just because you're going camping doesn't mean you get out of your weekend chores. We moaned and settled in to eat the hot cereal Mom had ladled into our bowls. Dad was already gone, having left early to work on a project in Basin at the family business. Fred and I would have been with him if we weren't going camping. We enjoyed working with Dad, but camping was definitely a more exciting way to spend our weekend. I heard that when boys freeze to death on a Klondike, they just chop a hole in the ice and shove 'em in, sleeping bag and all. Beatrice grinned wickedly from across the table. They do not. Fred fired back. Yes, they do, Beatrice replied. The ground's too frozen to give 'em a proper burial. Just eat your hot cereal, Mom growled. At 10 a.m., we pulled up to the American Legion, and before long, Cousin Jim's older brother Rockwell had pulled up in their old green Astrovan, too. Jim waved to Fred and I through the passenger door window, and we waved back. My wave was made a little less enthusiastic by the wad of tissues I was holding. Marty's mom came next, and the only person we were missing was Eli. Oh, I should have known he would be late, Mom growled. You boys are going to spend most of the day in the cold. You'll be all right if I just drop you off and let you wait for Eli in the parking lot, right? It was approximately 20 degrees, and a thick blanket of snow covered the parking lot, but the sidewalks were clear enough. We piled our gear onto the bare concrete, and Mom gave each of us a hug before driving away. The other boys' rides had similar ideas, and soon the whole troop was shivering in the cold outside the American Legion. Eli had been known to show up a half hour late for campouts, but I hoped he wouldn't take that long today. We didn't want to be the last troop to the reservoir and miss out on the good camping spots. I wish Eli would hurry up, Marty whined. It's cold. Finally, Eli's old pickup truck eased into the parking lot, the large white scout trailer in tow. Eli, where have you been? Jim hollered when the wiry scoutmaster slid from the driver's seat. Well, good morning to you too, Eli huffed. I had to pack the wall tent into the scout trailer. Now come on and load all your stuff. We got some winter camping to do. The drive to the Deaver Reservoir wasn't too far, but during the short trip I managed to put a sizable dent in the fresh box of tissues Mom had given me before she drove off that morning. When we pulled up to the reservoir, we were shocked to see the number of men and boys that surrounded the reservoir and dotted its frozen surface. Whoa, look at all the people here, Marty shouted. There must be at least 100. Let's hurry and find a good spot to pitch the wall tent, Eli grunted. Setting up the wall tent proved to be a time-consuming task, but once it was up, it cut a handsome figure next to all the dome and frame tents the other boys were setting up. We couldn't help but feel a little smug as Eli set the wood stove down in the tent and slid the stovepipe into place. I had no idea how the other scouts were going to keep from freezing in their little tents without stoves of their own, but then I saw a man cramming a queen-size mattress and a half-dozen quilts into his tent, and I was a little less worried about the other winter campers. If anything, there were certainly enough quilts and blankets around to smother anyone who got too cold. Get your stuff in here, and then you can go out on the ice, Eli instructed us. He didn't have to tell us twice. With all of our things situated in neat rows on the tarp floor of the wall tent, we boys rushed to join the throng of scouts running to and fro on the ice. The wind carried their voices and tossed them around, and no matter where you stood on the frozen reservoir, you could catch snippets of conversation. There were boys sliding around on tarps and sleds, and boys with fishing poles who had chopped out the ice that had formed in holes drilled by other ice fishermen. It wasn't too cold, probably about 25 degrees or so, and there was a stiff breeze blowing. For all that, if you kept moving, you could stay warm enough to manage. In my case, the wind was brutal on my nose, which had become raw as a porterhouse steak from all the wiping. In spite of the cold, we pushed each other around on an old plastic sled Jim had brought for a while, and then he had an idea. Scooping up his sled, he ran for the tent. Hold on, guys. I just thought of something. In a moment, he was back with one of the quilts from his stack of bedding. Here, tie the corners of this quilt onto my legs and ankles. He held out his arms in front of him and made a gesture with the quilt. More than a little confused, we did as Jim asked. With a little effort, we managed to tie the corners of his quilt around his ankles and wrists as requested, which is challenging while holding a wad of tissues and constantly wiping at your nose. The knots in place, we stepped back and watched expectantly as Jim sat down, straight-backed in the sled. As soon as he was situated, he raised his arms up to ear level, and I suddenly realized what he had in mind. When the wind caught the blanket, it immediately puffed up like a sail, and with a little bit of rocking forward and backward, the sled began to move, an inch at a time at first, and then faster. The breeze had risen to a pretty good wind at this point, and it didn't take long for Jim to really get going. "Woohoo!" he cheered like a kid on a roller coaster as he zipped over the ice. A laugh tore from my throat, which quickly morphed into a coughing fit as I watched him, his arms raised like some kind of bizarre marionette. "Come on," Fred yelled, taking off after Jim. We were hard-pressed to keep up with the speeding Boy Scout, and before long he was bouncing over old ice fishing holes and weaving between boys. A group of scouts paused in their game of ice hockey to watch the strange sight of a kid with a quilt tied to him like some kind of caped superhero in reverse, threading the needle through their defense. I think Jim would have made it clear across the reservoir, a distance of at least 300 yards, if he hadn't lost control trying not to get clotheslined by some boys who were pulling another kid around on a sled. He saw the rope just in time and bailed off onto the ice. The now empty sled skittered away, and Jim came up with a face full of snow and a grin that would have thawed the winter solstice. "That was awesome," Fred shouted, dragging the runaway sled back over to Jim. "Let's do that again." We took turns sliding back and forth across the ice until Eli waved us down and called us over to the tent. "What in tarnations are you doing out there?" he thundered. "It's like wind sledding, I guess," I offered, sniffing and folding the quilt under an arm. "Well, that looks like a heck of a lot of fun," Eli beamed. "Now come here and cook your dinner before it gets dark." Back at the tent, Eli had settled in by a campfire with a Dutch oven that emitted tantalizing smells whenever he lifted the lid to check on his supper. We looked on with more than a little jealousy as we heated water to make some top ramen. Eli surveyed our culinary efforts in disbelief. "Are you fellers really having ramen for dinner? You could have at least brought some hot dogs or something." "We just brought what we always eat on campouts," Marty shrugged sheepishly. "Backpacking is one thing, but this is car camping," Eli spluttered. "You could have brought anything you wanted to eat." Eli shook his head as Fred shook a seasoning packet out into the pot of hot water. Just then, the head of the local scout council walked up and looked over our camp with a practiced eye. "Nice setup you got here, Eli," he said approvingly. "Well, thank you kindly." Eli nodded, then motioned to his Dutch oven. "You already had some grub?" "I have, thanks." The council leader nodded politely. "We'll all eat well tomorrow, boys," he grinned. "There are 120 men and boys here tonight, and we've ordered pizza for everyone for lunch tomorrow. This is the best turnout we've had in years, and probably the first time we've had Troop 41 join us for a Klondike." "Well, we couldn't resist when we heard about it, huh, boys?" Eli said, turning toward us. "Nope, nuh-uh. Wouldn't miss it," we chorused. "Well, thanks for coming." The council head smiled and pumped Eli's hand. "We look forward to seeing you boys in the sled races tomorrow. Have a good night. I imagine you'll sleep warmer than most of the boys here tonight." If we didn't go to bed with bellies full of delicious food like Eli, then we at least did so feeling confident that we would beat the cold without any trouble. Around the reservoir, scouts and leaders crawled into their tents and settled in for a frigid night. In the wall tent, Eli stoked the fire, and I set my box of tissues next to my bed. I didn't have to worry about the cold outside, but the one raging inside my head was determined to make my night as miserable as possible. My nose ached as if someone had raked it with a cheese grater, and I found myself dabbing gingerly at my red nostrils in an attempt to avoid further irritating them. The pressure inside my head pounded away and made laying down a prolonged agony, and as other boys around me fell asleep one by one, I found myself just as awake and miserable as I had been when I zipped up my sleeping bag. For what must have been a few hours, but felt more like a century, I lay in the dark and sniffled in my misery. The glow of moonlight allowed me to just make out the roof of the tent above me, and as I watched, the canvas rippled in the wind and then began snapping against the frame of the tent, casually at first, and then more earnestly with each passing minute. With growing concern, I listened as what had been a stiff breeze during the day developed into solid gusts. Each gust brought a friend with it, and before I knew it, a winter gale had unleashed its fury on the tent. By this point, the others in the tent began to stir too, as the sound of the canvas blowing in the wind's grasp had increased to a volume that was more like the crack of a whip than anything else. The frame of the tent began to quake with each new gust of wind, and with a sudden burst, the wall of the tent blew up from where it connected to the tarp floor, and a wall of polar air came tearing through our snug sanctuary. "What the bleep?" Eli bellowed, except he didn't use quite that expression. Marty, thinking he could save the day, came boiling out of his sleeping bag and ran the full length of the tent at the loose tent wall. He intended, I'm sure, to reunite the canvas with the ground and stop the icy blast of wind that was pelting us, but he discovered quite suddenly that his weight was no match for the raw strength of nature. He plowed into the wall, and then was thrown backward as the fabric rebounded with so much force he very nearly rolled out the front door of the tent. "Marty, you idiot!" Eli yelled. All of us boys would later agree that Eli didn't seem too pleased with the whole situation. His bad humor was evident as he fished some black nylon cord out of his pack, and it only got worse as he tied loops in 8-inch lengths of the cord and instructed us to do the same. With a particularly snippy attitude, he fused the ends of the loops with his lighter and made a pile of them by the tent flap. "Al, Fred, I'm going to go out and pound stakes through these here loops. You two are going to feed them through the eyelets on the bottom of the tent as I come around with the sledgehammer." As he talked, Eli demonstrated what he was saying for us to see. "You got it?" We nodded our understanding, and then, like the hero in an old Western movie, Eli unzipped the tent door and ventured out into the awful storm. Inside the tent, Jim and Marty helped Fred and I as we made our way around the edge of the tent, poking the loops out into the storm and meeting with a fresh blast of wind each time the wall of the tent came up an inch. I don't think I've ever encountered a harsher winter storm since, and I will be surprised indeed if I ever do. By the time Eli staked all the eyelets of the tent to the ground and returned inside, his extremities were blue, and the frost that had gathered on his eyebrows would have made Jack Frost proud. "Gall darn," the wiry scoutmaster shuddered as he zipped the door closed again. "It's cold out there." With that understatement of the century hanging in the air, we slid back into our sleeping bags. Even though the wind continued howling like some kind of wild animal, and the canvas snapped against the tent frame, I managed to fall into something resembling sleep, for which I paid dearly when I woke up to find my face and lips caked in congealed mucus, like the hardened lava of a gently flowing shield volcano. In the morning, as I wiped at my smarting face, Fred yawned and rolled over. "Hey, Al," he grunted. "The wind's finally stopped." And indeed it had. The morning had dawned, cold and clear and calm. It was so quiet at the reservoir, you would have had no clue it had been an ant's nest of activity just the night before. Where there had been a sea of tents and vehicles, there now remained only a fraction of what had been there when we went to bed. "Golly," Marty breathed as we surveyed the wind-scoured reservoir. "Where did everybody go?" Maybe they all blew away, I offered, picturing dome tents bouncing along the ice with sleeping bag ensconced scouts inside of them. Not all of them, came a harsh voice from behind us. We whirled to see the council head standing by the tent, his face haggard and his eyes bloodshot. You look like you didn't sleep a bit, Eli said. The council head nodded tiredly. It's because I didn't, he said. It's hard to sleep when your tent is wrapped around your nose. We went to bed last night with 120 men and boys, and now there's only 60. The entire troop from Powell just decided they couldn't take it anymore. They all loaded up and drove off. We lost most of the Cody scouts, half of the boys and leaders from Lovell, and a bunch of others. Do you know how hard that wind was blowing last night? 90 miles an hour. A hunted look flashed across the man's face, and I felt sorry for him. I guess this is why Marty's dad never took us to a Klondike, huh? I asked Eli with a sniffle. Eli gave us a wry smile and nodded. I guess so. They didn't hold the sled races and the other winter events they had planned for that day. Instead, we ate breakfast and broke down camp. Removing all those stakes Eli had pounded took us an hour and a half because the ground was frozen solid, but we did it. The atmosphere around the reservoir was much more subdued that morning, and even though we joked a bit and were looking forward to getting home, it still seemed unbelievable that so many Boy Scouts had just up and left during the night. I guess the lack of mosquitoes wasn't enough to get them to stay. As we closed the back doors on the scout trailer, Eli blew on his hands to warm them. Well, come on, boys. Let's get over to the church for the closing ceremony. On his way to the truck, Marty suddenly stopped dead in his tracks. Guys, he blurted out. What, Marty? Fred asked, concern evident in his voice. What's wrong? Didn't that guy say they ordered the pizza yesterday? Yeah, I think so, Fred said. So what? You guys, yesterday there were 120 scouts and leaders here. An enormous grin split Marty's face. Today, there's only 60. Realization dawned on each of us, and grins that matched Marty's spread across each of our faces. Yes, everyone who went on that Klondike will forever remember the worst winter storm of the decade, but everyone who stayed through the night will never forget the pizza, especially Marty. He had 18 slices. Well, there you go. Another untold tale from this side of nowhere. That was quite the night and a terrible storm. Oh gosh, there really were men and boys bouncing across the ice that night. It's kind of a miracle nobody died, honestly. But we sure were thankful for that wall tent, and if I ever go camping in the snow again, I am most certainly going to do it with a wall tent. Well, if you have a winter camping experience, maybe you've been on a Klondike before, feel free to message me on Facebook or shoot me an email at untoldtalesthepodcast@gmail.com. And as always, it's been great sharing this story with you, even with half a voice. And I hope here in a couple weeks, I'll have my voice back and that episode will sound a little bit more normal. Until then, this has been another Untold Tale from this side of nowhere, where we work twice as hard for half as much and still find time for the important things like fishing. See you next time, folks.